Hello, kids. Welcome to another President's History presentation. This one will be on Presidents 16 through 20, and we will be roughly covering the Civil War through Reconstruction, the years 1861 through 1877. So let's recap as we always do. First, George Washington, John Adams, keep going the wrong way, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Harrison, John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. So those are the presidents 1 through 15. And now it is time to talk about Presidents 16 through 20, starting with Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. Just to note before we get started, this is probably the most formative time in American history. I cannot underestimate the importance and the continuing reverberations through history of what happened during the Civil War as a continuance of the race relation issues that had been bubbling up under the surface in the New Republic in the antebellum era, reaching back to the colonial era of the early modern period. So the Civil War is where all of those issues, especially the issue of slavery, came to a head, and it ended in the formation of two separate states, the United States, the Union, and the Confederacy, led by two different presidents, Lincoln and then Jefferson Davis on the other side. So the Civil War was the most deadly war in U.S. history because all casualties were U.S. casualties. All right, so without further ado, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. Remember, we talk about the president, their background, their domestic policy. Typically, presidents are divided in different parties, and there's usually one party of big government and one party of small government. Foreign policy, how are they dealing with outside countries? How are they dealing with their neighbors? How are they dealing outside the country? All right, so Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president from 1861 to 1865. He grew up on a farm in Kentucky. He had little schooling. He primarily taught himself by whatever books he could get his hands on. When he was 21, he moved to Illinois. He tried many jobs as an adult. In 1834, he decided to run for state legislator to help pay off his debts. At that time, he was a member of the Whig Party and was a big supporter of Henry Clay. Later, he became a lawyer in Springfield. As a lawyer, he crafted his skills as an orator. He was known for being able to simplify complex ideas and make them clear. He returned to politics as a strong opponent to slavery. He strongly opposed the expansion of slavery into new states. He gave his House Divided speech, which emphasized that a house divided by slavery cannot stand. In 1854, Lincoln helped form the Republican Party to specifically oppose slavery. In 1860, he was nominated for president by the Republican Party, and he won. So Lincoln helps form the Republican Party, and he wins the presidency. All right, his domestic policy. After Lincoln was elected, the South seceded or left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. After South Carolina left the Union, they demanded the U.S. Army leave Fort Sumter in Charleston. Confederates attacked the fort, and the Civil War began. Northerners thought that the war would be short due to their superiority in wealth and numbers, population numbers. However, the South had really great generals like Robert E. Lee and General George McClellan. McClellan had a well-respected background, but proved he was not willing to take risks and fight. Lee, on the other hand, was a very, very skilled general throughout the Civil War. Robert E. Lee for the South. McClellan fought for the Union. My bad, I read that incorrectly. McClellan was in the Union, and he was not willing to take risks, and Lincoln had to replace him with Ulysses S. Grant. And in fact, Grant was so willing to send his men into battle that some people considered him a butcher. He ultimately was victorious, Grant was, and forced the South to surrender. Lincoln, however, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth shortly after the war while he was at a play. So, domestic policy for Lincoln, a lot of stuff going on. We can't get into a lot of the details of the Civil War here. I will read a famous letter, a famous note here from a famous speech from Abraham Lincoln to talk about his skills as an orator before we move on to the other presidents. But let's talk about foreign policy under Lincoln first. The most significant thing he did was the Union blockade around the South. He prevented the South from trading and getting supplies from other countries, and this was critical to winning the Civil War. The Union used 500 ships. They destroyed or captured 1,500 blockade runners. The blockade is also known as General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. This one's worth holding up. It's got the anaconda wrapping around the South there. All right, so there was a great Civil War battle called the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and upon the dedication of a cemetery, final resting place for the fallen soldiers there, Abraham Lincoln put together a speech. It's a very famous speech for being very short. It's one of the most famous speeches in U.S. history. It's called the Gettysburg Address. This is a facsimile of it, and I'm going to do my best to read it. This is the speech. Okay. Actually, no, I'm missing a part of it. Let me go back to page 36 to find the rest. There we go. Gettysburg. There we go. Sorry about that, kids. Yep. So here is the last part of the Gettysburg Address. So I will do my best in Lincoln's writing here. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who died here, that this nation might live. This we do, this we may in all propriety do. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have hallowed it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little now or long remember what we say here, while it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us, the living, we few, he crossed something out here, be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to their cause, for which they few gave the last full measure of devotion, that we few highly resolve them that the dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So I deeply apologize for missing a few of those for you. What I should do is post a copy of the Gettysburg Address on the follow-up for this exercise so we may continue. But that is a classic speech by Abraham Lincoln. It is one of the most famous speeches in U.S. history, and I would be remiss if I didn't read it to you. So let's talk about some fun facts about Abraham Lincoln. Well, it says here, every child knows the stories. There is simply no end to Lincoln lore. The one-room Kentucky log cabin he was born in, the nicknames Honest Abe and the Rail Splitter, the stirring oratory of the Gettysburg Address, the way he changed for all time the course of human history. Yes, that's true. There's so many stories about Honest Abe, Abe Lincoln. In 1863, Lincoln issued his great Emancipation Proclamation declaring slavery unlawful in the rebellious states. The Emancipation Proclamation, an incredibly important part of his work. The Union forces routed the Confederate troops at Gettysburg, and by the day of Lincoln's second inauguration in the winter of 1865, General Sherman was nearing the end of his annihilating march to the sea. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant on the steps of Appomattox Courthouse. 5 nights later, a bullet fired by the pro-slavery actor John Wilkes Booth, who had stolen into the presidential box at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., deflected the president from the high road of life. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln, the nonpareil wordsmith, had somberly reminded the country he was struggling to unite, that it was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Yet down all the arches of the years ahead, there had been none to equal him. Lincoln was both the mold and the clay. So Lincoln, the author of this selection here on the presidents, receives very high praise as one of the finest presidents of the United States for his role in bringing the Union back together in the Civil War. All right, so let's move on to Andrew Johnson, who was president from 1865 to 1869. Andrew Johnson was born in a log cabin in Raleigh, North Carolina. As a young man, he got elected as a mayor of Greenville, Tennessee. He later got elected to the state and federal legislature. Johnson was a Democrat. He supported having a small government, and he believed in the right to own slaves. He gained a following among small farmers and the poor. Although Johnson supported slavery, he was strongly against the South leaving the Union. He tried to convince Southerners that they could control Congress under Lincoln with a majority. Johnson became what was known as a war Democrats, or Democrats that sided with Lincoln to preserve the Union. In 1864, Lincoln chose Johnson as his running mate for his loyalty and Southern background. In 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson became president. Johnson's presidency, and this is his domestic policy, was a period of great political hostility. Johnson wanted the Southern states to rejoin the Union as if nothing ever happened. He was up against the Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans in Congress who wanted to punish the South and remake it in their image. Johnson used his power as president to veto these bills by the Republicans. In response to Johnson's disinterest in reconstructing the South, the Republicans tried to have him impeached for firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The trial lasted for 3 months, and Johnson escaped impeachment by 1 vote. Almost got impeached. All right, an interesting thing with respect to his foreign policy. Under Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward negotiated with Russia to purchase the territory of Alaska. The land was purchased for $7.2 million. Johnson thought acquiring the new land would help cool things down in Congress and help him politically. However, the public did not like the purchase. They thought it was a worthless piece of land. Some people called Alaska Seward's icebox or Seward's folly. However, gold was discovered in Alaska in 1896, which attracted a rush of settlers. So Alaska was bought from Russia for $7.2 million. All right, Andrew Johnson. Clearly not nearly as popular a president as Lincoln. Clearly a lot of people disagreed with him. He looked like he wanted to move forward as if the South had done nothing wrong by seceding over the issue of slavery. He's opposed by a lot of radical Republicans. He became the president in one of the most traumatic moments in U.S. history. Yeah, it says here, as a frankly racist Southerner and champion of states' rights, Johnson was in favor of permitting slavery in newly acquired territories. He drew the line, however, at secession. He tried to prevent Tennessee from seceding and refused to resign his Senate seat. He was the only Southern senator to stand by the Union. So he did want to stay with the Union, but he also was pro-slavery. So this Johnson character, president, very interesting. He did not go down in history as a popular president at all. In fact, most people, he's just not a very popular president at all for his policies. It was really under the next president that we got the process of Reconstruction began. And Reconstruction, of course, was how are we going to put this country back together? So let's talk about that next president. It's following in the tradition of another war hero. That would be Ulysses S. Grant, who was president from 1869 to 1877. Ulysses Grant first gained military experience during the Mexican-American War. He was not a supporter of the war, and he called the war one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. Grant did not do well in civilian life. Okay, he had a lot of bad vices that just did not help him out outside of the military. He gained a reputation as a leader who was willing to fight and win during the Civil War. Before he took Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, he demanded unconditional and immediate surrender. The press started to call him Unconditional Surrender Grant. Okay? Grant led the Union to a succession of victories that turned the war to their favor. He captured the city of Vicksburg, which gave the North control of the Mississippi River. I was actually talking to Henry about this. He and I were having an argument over what was the most important Civil War battle, and he actually argued for this Battle of Vicksburg. And he gave the same argument that it gave the North control of the Mississippi River. Knowing how much he has studied the Civil War, I'm probably going to go with him on that one. Grant led the Overland Campaign, where he chased down the armies of Robert E. Lee and forced the South to surrender. All right, so Grant's presidency is also known as the Reconstruction Era. This is the period of time when the North ruled the South as an occupying force. Laws were enacted to give African Americans more freedom and rights. A group of politicians called Radical Republicans, remember Thaddeus Stevens and going against Andrew Johnson, dominated Congress at this time. Lincoln had freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. However, they now had to establish themselves as citizens. A series of amendments to the Constitution were added at this time called Reconstruction Amendments. These laws were designed to give African Americans and all minorities equal protection under the law. Grant also supported Native American rights. He established the Board of Indian Commissioners to improve relations with them. The ironic thing here is that even though he had these Reconstruction Amendments, it would take until the 20th century to give women similar rights to vote as men had. So let's take all of this with a grain of salt. All right, let's look at the foreign policy of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was interested in annexing the Dominican Republic or taking it and making it a part of U.S. territories. He thought that the new land could be a place for recently freed African Americans to settle and make a new life. However, Grant could not get political support for his vision, and it never happened. Grant wanted Britain to repay the United States for damages caused by Confederate ships that were built in British shipyards. They asked for a $2 billion payment or part of Canada. An agreement was made whereby the U.S. got access to fishing waters and was paid a smaller amount. So we have the continuing economic reverberations of the Civil War afterwards, dealing with Canada and Britain. Very, very interesting. It's interesting. Wars always involve far more victims and other parties than you first think. So let's talk about some fun facts about Ulysses S. Grant. It says he was just as irresolute a president as he was determined a general. Okay. He fought alongside other officers in the Mexican War, including his later adversary, Robert E. Lee. His full genius as a military strategist was demonstrated in the 47-day siege of Vicksburg, and the enemy capitulated or gave up on July 4th, 1863, a day after the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay. Ulysses S. Grant became the first American since George Washington to be awarded the rank of full general by Congress. And in 1868, the Republicans unanimously, or all of them, nominated him for president. Okay. It says on the whole, however, Grant governed mostly by neglect. He just wasn't a very effective president, although he did have good intentions to begin the process of rebuilding the South through the period of Reconstruction. All right, so that was the Civil War and Reconstruction. We're going to move just a little bit further into the 1880s with Rutherford B. Hayes and James Garfield. So Rutherford B. Hayes, also a Republican. So if you see here, Republican, Democrat, remember Lincoln chose Johnson because he wanted to have more support from a broader group of people. Republican. Hayes started off as a lawyer working in Cincinnati, Ohio. Hey, I live there. He was a supporter of the abolition of slavery. When the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, he used his skills as a lawyer to help defend captured men from being returned to the South. His work as an abolitionist lawyer got him noticed by the Republican Party. When the Confederate States seceded from the Union, Hayes, like many Northerners, was glad to see them go. However, when the war started, Hayes joined to fight. He distinguished himself as an officer and rose to the rank of brigadier general. Before the war ended, he ran for the House of Representatives and got elected. Hayes supported the policies of the Republicans in the aftermath of the war. He also supported impeaching President Johnson. All right, so let's go to his domestic policy. Hayes was elected as president during a time of scandal among the Republican Party. By then, the states of the South had been readmitted into the Union. However, there were still federal troops in those territories to reinforce the laws. This is the period of Reconstruction. The presidential election of 1876 was so close that an electoral commission had to decide the winner due to claims of fraud. The South agreed to allow Hayes to become president if the federal troops were removed. This agreement is seen as the end of the Reconstruction era. So this is when the federal troops leave the South. During his presidency, Hayes tried to reform the spoils system that was creating so much scandal in Washington. The spoils system was established by Andrew Jackson as a way of rewarding political donors. Hayes supported the Pendleton Act, which stated that political positions needed to be appointed by merit. Yes, this whole spoils system had been a big issue, and it kept getting bigger and bigger. It started under Jackson, and basically, rewarding political donors with offices, etc. This was not a good thing. So Hayes is trying to reform that. All right, foreign policy. Hayes's foreign policy issue was basically dealing with the large influx of immigrants from China. In 1868, the Burlingame Treaty was signed with China. This was an agreement that allowed for as many people to come from China as wanted to come. However, people were getting upset that these cheap laborers were lowering wages in the United States. So the Chinese were coming in, new immigrants, and they were working for lower wages. Okay? The Democrats tried to pass a Chinese Exclusion Act to keep China from sending immigrants to the United States. Hayes vetoed the bill. The law did not pass until after his presidency in 1882. This would actually continue to be another issue moving forward in the United States. How do you deal with immigrants from different countries and nations? So in the very beginning, during the colonial era, most of the settlers that came in were from parts of Northwest Europe, basically England, and then you started getting more from places like Germany, France, Scotland, Ireland, and others, and then you got more people from Central Europe, Germany, Poland, Italy, etc. And now we're starting to get settlers from all around the world. The question of how the United States deals with the issue of immigration, how do you deal with new people coming into the country given the political system that we have with freedom of religion, freedom of speech, etc. This is a real telltale sign of how this country is developing. It's not always pretty. Sometimes it's ugly. Oftentimes, when new immigrants come to the United States, the people who have been here are prejudiced against them, do not understand them, and treat them poorly. And the Chinese and many other immigrant groups were among those that were treated poorly by the people that were living here already. And don't even get me started about how the Native Americans had continued to be treated overall by the people who had come here during the colonial era. It's a black mark on U.S. history, but as I tell you guys, I will never shy away from giving you facts and the evidence. But again, I always tell my college students the same thing. Do your own research, do your own work, because ultimately that's what we're trying to train you to do at school already. The whole thing, it's all about critical thought. All right, I think I've got one more to go, but let me see if I have any fun facts about Rutherford B. Hayes, who was president from 1877 to 1881. Okay. Yep, Cincinnati lawyer. He was more successful when it came to striking a blow at the corrupt spoils system. Okay, he went over the head of patronage potentate, powerful person Roscoe Conkling, to personally fire the future 21st president of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, from his powerful job as a collector of customs for the port of New York. As with the adoption of the Specie Resumption Act, he managed to reinstate the gold standard. In 1879, we talked about this, he vetoed Congress's first attempt to ban Chinese immigration. It says here, all in all, Hayes restored in full measure the dignity of the presidency. Ethical to the end, he made good on his campaign pledge not to run for a second term. So he was like, I'm going to do this once, and I'm done. All right, let's talk about James Garfield, the 20th president. Let's talk about his background. And he was only president for 1 year, 1881. Garfield was born on a farm in Ohio. He became a lawyer and later entered politics. Politically, he sided with the Republicans and was against slavery. During the Civil War, he fought for the North and was a major general. In 1862, Garfield ran for Congress in Ohio and won. In Congress, he initially supported the radical Republicans, but later he supported a more moderate approach to dealing with the South. In 1879, Garfield got nominated by the Republican Party to run for president because he was seen as a moderate. Garfield was chosen over Ulysses S. Grant, who was looking to get elected to a third term. Isn't that interesting? Ulysses S. Grant is back in the ring. All right. Garfield was in office for only 200 days before he was shot by a man who was refused a federal job. In the little time he was president, he saw cleaning up corruption as his main goal. He advocated or wanted incompetent government employees to be fired. In other words, government employees that were just not doing their jobs. He wanted them fired. He also had Congress investigate corruption in the post office. He was concerned with the plight of the free slaves in the South. He wanted to find out what was going on with them. Only about 30% of African Americans in the South could read at this time. He did not want these people to be stuck in poverty, and so he advocated universal education to be funded. Garfield could not get Congress to support his idea of federally funded education. Okay, so he was trying to look out and deal with corruption and help the people in the South, but Congress was not working with him. And he was shot 200 days into office, so literally president less than a year. In 1879, the War of the Pacific broke out between Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. Garfield's Secretary of State, James Blaine, tried to help negotiate an end to the war. A conference was scheduled in Washington so that the countries could meet and settle their dispute. However, Garfield was assassinated before this meeting took place. So, James A. Garfield, not president for very long, had a lot of good intentions. Let's see what's going on with him. Fun facts. Yeah, in July 1881 at the railroad station in Washington, D.C., he was shot, and he died on September 19th of 1881. The royal courts of Europe proceeded to break precedent by observing an official day of mourning for the mere president of the republic. So he was mourned even in Europe. So, sad ending to the presidency of James Garfield. Now, kids, I did want to share something else with you before we move forward. I got a couple of things. Well, first, I have a great book on the Civil War that I would love for you to explore when we get back to the class. It's a great book. It has primary source document facsimiles or copies that you can look at, like the ones that I used for the Gettysburg Address. And I also wanted to talk to you about a fun project that we may do. It's called the Civil War Letters Project. And I don't know about you, but trying to make or fake historical documents is a lot of fun. So what we've done in the past, and this is something that I may do with some of you, is have students create Civil War letters, pretend to be a nurse, a soldier, a doctor, a farmer. Pretend to be someone who's living in that 1861 to 1865 era and create a series of letters between people that basically tells a story. And not only is telling the story a lot of fun, but you can also do the story in many, many fun ways. You can do the classic coffee aging thing there. You can have, oh, here's someone, looks like something bad happened to that person. I've got the remnants of a note there. I've got handwritten ones. I love it when kids do it in cursive. And I've had kids add to the evidence of our Civil War letters for years. And you just make up characters and dates. This is a letter to Pa, dated December 16th from 1863 from one Lexi. Okay. And here's Pa writing back to his family in December of 18... Look, and here's February of 1864. Lexi's writing to her father again. So you can create an entire narrative. Okay. I got small notes. I got big notes. Okay? Dear brother, I am sorry that I am in jail. I have a very bad leg infection. I am not able to cut it off because I do not have a bone saw. I will send another note soon. Please send a letter back. We are also fighting. I don't understand what that one is. But the interesting thing is that it's talking about historical stuff, and there are purposeful misspellings. I love purposeful misspellings to show an effort to imitate someone who may not be that well educated, but who is nonetheless educated enough to write a letter back home during the Civil War. So if this assignment comes your way, I'm thinking about it for a few cohorts. You can really have fun with it. I've got someone who's made an address here. I've got someone who's, look at that one. That one is really looking good. And there are many ways to age them. There's the coffee staining one. Here's Pa and Lexi again. You can also do the lemon juice thing. Oh, here's a good one. And here's another good one. And what I often do is just have the kids go through and read them. You can learn a lot just by the imagination of a child, okay? And I've got one here where somebody's a spy, and he's writing letters back and saying, hey, they don't know I'm spying on them. So a lot of really interesting Civil War letters, and I've been having students write these for years. I just saw the names of some students that I haven't had in 8, 9, 10 years. So the Civil War letters is a fun writing assignment that we may or may not get to for some of you. But I just want to give you a heads up that if I ask you to watch the end of the video on Presidents 16 through 20, that you do that and you prepare yourself for the Civil War letters. I appreciate you watching. This has gone a little bit over half an hour. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this presidential presentation. Have a good day.